So what I'm going to do, I'm going to start by giving a short account of the Mesolithic period for those who are not that familiar with it, its place in time and what was going on generally in Ireland at that time. And then I'll hand over to Elaine, and she will go through the excavation details of the methods that we used on these sites, which are quite exposed on the coast, and the difficulties we had to deal with and how we managed that. And then it'll come back to me, and I go through the finds, both the organic and the stone finds that we found on the site. So I'll start off with the Mesolithic period. And why is this not working now? Oh, yeah. Sorry, I'm just having a little bit of a delay here. Yeah. So if you look at this line diagram here, it shows you the last 15,000 years approximately. And at the bottom there, you can see the cultural periods. And the Mesolithic one is in the center. And it runs from the end of the last ice age, 11,700 years ago, to roughly 6,000 years ago, which is the beginning of the Neolithic or Stone Age farming period. And you can see Powell-na-Brone there is the start of the farming period. So within that period, hunter-gatherers arrive in Ireland around 9,700 years ago on the first, at Mount Sandal. You can see that site there. And we have them in Ireland for 4,000 years virtually. Now, you can see where Doolin and the two sites in Fanor are at the, towards the end of they're in the later Mesolithic period. So the Mesolithic period is the longest, as I said, the longest cultural period, but probably the poor relation in our Irish archaeology and the one that's received the least amount of attention. And that's understandable because these people are hunter-gatherers. They don't build big stone monuments that they put in the landscape that have survived till today, and they don't build very permanent houses. Most of what they leave us is very scant remains of houses. If you're lucky to find them, they're just post holes and hearths and pits. And the one thing that they do leave that we find regularly in the landscape are what we call lithic scatters, and that's where they've been making their stone tools, and we find those. So most sites that have been found in Ireland have been as the result of lithic scatters. So the next question to ask is, what animals did they have here? Because they're hunter-gatherers, and obviously the animals are most important to them. And you can see there what was available in mammals. Bear and wild boar were the two largest mammals, and then all the other smaller ones that we have today, except for the wolves. Sea mammals would have been very important to them because they would be a large mammal that was available to them. But it's what's not available is the more important thing, and that's red deer and wild cattle were not available. They did not make it across the Irish Sea at the end of the Ice Age, but they made it over to Britain. So hunter-gatherers in Britain hunted these two species widely as they did on the continent. And they were most Mesolithic sites in Britain have the remains of both these species, or a lot of them do. So they provided food, skins, bone and antler for tools. So they were a very important part of the Mesolithic period there. So that makes Ireland different from the word go. We were completely different to what's going on across the water. So the Irish had to deal with a different situation. So what happened was that meant that their toolkit changed over time. And the late Professor Peter Woodman was the man who spent his lifetime dealing with researching the Irish archaeology. And he defined the Irish Mesolithic phases and tool of evolution that happened. So in the early Mesolithic period, you can see there for about 1,000 years, you had microliths and core axes and flake axes, which were the same as what they had across the way. But moving into the later Mesolithic, which lasts for nearly 3,000 years, there was a complete change in the toolkit with these, what's known as butt-trim band flakes, much larger flakes, larger tools, carry points and coarse stone choppers. And I'll deal with these tools later on as we find them. I won't go through them all now. Ground stone axes are important. They're the normal stone axes that you see in most museums. They were in the Mesolithic. They're always regarded as Neolithic farmers' tools, but in fact, they were in the Mesolithic in Ireland from the word go in both the early and the later phases. So the next slide shows you the early and later Mesolithic distribution in Ireland, the sites. And as you can see there, an awful lot of these sites are in the north of Ireland and down the east coast. But that is a result of the antiquarians who collected stone tools avidly in the north of Ireland. So most of these sites are as a result of finding these lithic scatters. So it's sort of distorted picture. And a lot of the sites down in Cork are as a result of Peter Woodman moving down to Cork as professor of archaeology and doing study work around Cork, and then sites start appearing down there. And you'll see in the later Mesolithic, his site out on the west coast of Kerry, where at Ferreter's Cove, which is a landmark site in the later Mesolithic. Now, you can notice there that Clare has no sites. And that was the situation right up into the 2000s until we found these sites on the coast in Clare. So now there are at least three sites that we know of in County Clare. The two shell middens at Fenor. Shell middens are places where people came and gathered seashells for food. They cook them, eat them, and discard the shells. And that's why you get these large heaps of shells that survive for a very long time. Now, shell middens are found throughout Ireland, throughout all periods. We have shell middens that are only a couple of 100 years old, but they can go, as you see, go back to the 6,500 years in this case. And then down in Doolin, we have where they were manufacturing stone axes. So I'm going to hand you over to Elaine now, and she will run through the methods that we used on the excavation on the three sites.
Thanks, Michael. The two sites of Fenor are located to the south of Fenor Beach, and the site at Doolin is located just directly to the northwest of at the estuary of the River Oila. Now, the sites at both sites at Fenor and Doolin became exposed due to weather and sea erosion, and they've been part of a rescue and research excavation over the past few years. Now, the site of Fenor 1, which was our first site that we excavated, was found when a band of seashells became visible. And also what we also found was this clay layer, and within the clay layer there was numerous heat-shattered stones. Now, before each excavation, we assess the site and determine the best area of the site to excavate. So we plan and survey the site and mark out trenches we aim to excavate. So here you can see all the trenches for site 1 that we excavated over the 3 years. So we ended up doing quite a large area of the site. Now, once the area is plotted out and marked and the trenches are set up, we start the excavation. We excavate down and remove each layer, which we assign a context number to. So in the case of Fenor Site 1, we had a very deep layer of sand to remove before we found our archaeological layers. As we excavate each layer, we record it by drawing, photographing, and a written description of the layer or feature that we have found. We have an extensive paper documentation that is done on the site throughout the excavation, and is very important to record this activity because once the archaeology is excavated, it's gone. Now, the paper record consists of a context register, which is where we give a context number for each new layer or feature which is uncovered. And for every context number, we fill out context sheets, which we record the context in detail by describing the layer and any other important details. We also take levels of all the layers and features found during the excavation. Now, we also have a sample register where we take soil samples away from the site to be processed for environmental analysis, which is done after an excavation. We have a photo register and a drawing register. Now, these registers help us keep track on what has been done on the site, and also helps us to make sure that the contexts have all been photographed and drawn, and where needed, samples taken. Now, there's also a finds register where each find is given its own number, which is associated with the context it was found in. Now, we record the location of each find and take levels, which enables us to get an idea what depths the finds are located, and it enables us to do spatial distribution of the artifacts from the site, which is done at the post-ex stage. Now, the importance of recording each layer or feature on a site is that it tells us about the relationship of the activity on the site itself. So in this slide, you can see what's called as a matrix. And this is for one of our trenches, trench 8. So as you can see, we have a large number of contexts. And this matrix helps us to understand the relationship between all the layers and deposits within that trench 8. So, and just here is an example of our drawings that we would do during the excavation. So this is a plan of our trench 8 on the left hand, and these are 2 section drawings. So that's showing the layers in section. So at Fenor Site 1, we uncovered an area of shell which was concentrated to the south edge of the site. So this is actually, if you can see it down at the bottom, I've shown it, highlighted it here in red. Now, the shell layer was not very deep on the site, and we were able to identify a few small separate dumps, which included a layer of crushed burnt shell. So as you can see from the plan, the shell activity on the site was contained to this area and not very extensive, as we initially thought when the site first became exposed, because the first thing we saw was the shells. But surrounding the shell deposits and extending across all of our trenches was a clay layer, which had frequent inclusions of heat-shattered stones. It was really within this layer that we found most of our stone artifacts. Now, so here in the top picture is just a view of our shell layers. And then the bottom photo is us excavating the clay layer. And here we are exposing all the heat-shattered stones and any artifacts within it. And then the middle photo then is our trench 8, which was our largest trench. And that's a view of the clay layer just as it's starting to be exposed. Now, that's our site 1. And at Fenor Site 2, this site was located further to the south of site 1. Now, we actually had more significant depth of archaeological layers in comparison to site 1. Now, the shell layer was much deeper, and we had multiple different layers and deposits of complete shells along with layers of crushed burnt shell. Now, underneath these deposits, we had a layer of clay, but there was very little in the way of archaeological activity throughout the clay, unlike site 1, where all of our material was really within that clay layer. Now, all the finds from site 2 were found throughout these deposits, these shell deposits and shell layers. Now, we did have an area of burning on the surface of the clay, which indicates a possible, this is actually a view of the clay layer being exposed from site 2. Now, we did find an area of burning on the surface of the clay, which indicates a possible fireplace or an area of heating. And you can see it here. It's this red burnt clay layer. Now, we did also find numerous heat-shattered stones, but the heat-shattered stones were found in the upper contexts and the shell layers again, whereas in site 1, it was throughout that clay layer. So we just really have a very different site in comparison to site 1. Site 2 was just very different. So as a major part of our excavation was the on-site sieving. Now, we 100% sieved all the archaeological contexts from both of our sites. Now, a lot of this was done during the excavation, but we also took some of it away to finish at a later date, as there was a lot of material to sieve through. So here we are doing it after the excavation. Now, the importance of sieving it all, Mike is going to reveal what we found post-sieving after we sieved. So the importance of sieving 100%, he has some interesting finds that we found. Now, I do have to mention our Burren BO volunteers who, without them, these sites could not have been excavated and recorded to the extent they were. Now, they volunteered their time and were invaluable in the recording of the collection and of the information from the excavations, which is actually still ongoing today. Now, the excavation at Doolin varied in comparison to the sites at Fenor. We were kind of lucky in Fenor in relation to the location of the sites where we were in Fenor, the sites were located kind of at the edge of the storm beach, where at Doolin, it's located underneath. So in Fenor, we were able to open up large trenches. And I'll just show you now what Doolin looks like. So this is, a similar landscape, storm beach stones, but in Doolin, the stones are very large, like these huge, huge boulders. And the difference with this coastline is that, the sea is very volatile here, and the storm beach is constantly shifting and moving around, and the site of Doolin is always being eroded and exposed. So here's just another view of the site with the sand dunes in the back. Now, our initial work involved surveying and monitoring a 200-meter area of this coast. Now, we laid out yellow markers every 10 meters so that we could plot each of the finds and the clay layer at Doolin that became exposed. Now, this enables us to be able to see where the material is coming from and in relation to our excavated trenches. So then, depending on the amount of finds being eroded, we decide if an area warrants excavation. Now, it is impossible to excavate all of the clay layer being exposed, and this is just happening all the time, and we'd have to be down there nearly every day. But we are constantly monitoring the situation with the help of the volunteers. Now, the markers also assist us with determining how much of the clay layer is being eroded over the past few years, so we can see where the clay first started to become visible to us when we went down, and how much has actually eroded over the past few years. Now, we have to time our excavations of each trench carefully, and is completely dependent on when and if an area opens up, which warrants excavation. We have factors to take into consideration, like the weather and the times of the tides. So when we do aim for an area, we have to get in and out fast, as the site itself, the area opened, could actually be covered overnight, and the boulders are just too large to be removed. Now, this is just what they look like, the areas when they open up. Now, we can't set up grids like we could at Fanor. So here, as you can see, we excavate what we can, and we excavate kind of around the boulders. So what we do have at Doolin is similar to Fanor 1, is a layer of clay, and within this clay layer we have found a range of stone artifacts associated with stone tool making that Michael will discuss later. Now, there isn't much in the way of deposits or layers on this site, and all the archaeological activity appears to be concentrated within the clay layer itself. Now, during one of our early excavations, we did find 2 distinctive separate layers of debitage flakes from where someone was napping and making roughouts. Now, we found deposited on top of the earliest layer was a stone blank, and that's what you can see in the photo here, this nice stone piece here. Which this piece may have been deposited or dropped after they'd finished working in the area. Now, since we did record this activity as 2 separate events during the excavation, and each were given its own context number, we dated these 2 layers, and it turns out they were separated by 300 years. So basically, we found an area where someone initially started working, and they were sitting in the area working on their stone tools, and deposited this blank on top of their flake, the waste flakes that they were doing, and maybe they dropped it. And then 300 years later, another person was working in the same area and napping on their stone tools. So that's what we found, and that's the importance of recording various layers and deposits during an excavation. But I'm going to pass you back now to Michael, and he's going to go through all the stone tools that we found from both the sites.
Okay, thank you, Elaine, for that. So the 2, I'll deal with the 2 sites in Fanor first, and go with the organic remains. So you can see here, obviously the organic remains were dominated by the shells. So you have a whole range of shells here. When the slide comes up, it's a bit delayed. Yeah, there we have it. And we have periwinkles, limpets, and a range of other smaller amounts of dogwhelk and top shell, mussels, etc. So these we quantified all these and took them away, and the dominant species was periwinkle, closely followed by limpet, and then smaller amounts of the others. What we found in these shells were quite a significant number had perforations on them, and you can see here the perforations. Can you? Yeah, you can see there a lot of the shells had perforations on them. Now, at first we thought they were natural perforations, but our specialist reckoned that some of these were man-made perforations. And when we looked at that, we found that to be so when we looked at them more closely. Now, the explanation for that, the one that comes to mind straight away is that they're using, although they're consuming most of the periwinkles and limpets themselves, they are using a lot of them maybe for bait, for fishing. And you'll see later that we do have fish from the site as well. So that is one explanation for them. But some of the perforations are quite perfect, and a lot of trouble went into making them. So it's not just making a hole through the shell to thread it for bait. You can see that limpet in the center there has a very large, absolutely perfect perforation. That is made for some other reason. And some of the other ones there are rubbed perforations. And the small shell on the left-hand side is a very small netted dog whelk, which is too small to use for food or for things. So there is a suggestion that these might have been for personal adornment or jewelry. So if you see the next type of shell that we found are the cowrie shells, and they'll come up now in a second. There we have cowrie shells, and you can see cowrie shells are found along the west coast of Ireland quite readily, and you can see a bunch of them there that some of the volunteers picked it up on the Galway coast. They're common in Clare as well, not as common, but if you know where to look, you can find them. But the three underneath are the three gems from our site. These are three cowrie shells, which are only about 1 centimetre wide, with double perforations on them. So here we have shell beads. So this is very significant because these are, one thing is that they're the earliest jewelry, if you like, known from Ireland. The second thing is, that's even more important, and that is that these shells, perforated cowrie shells in the Mesolithic, are also found in Scotland, Wales, Britain, and in France around the later Mesolithic period. So there is a relationship between these people on the west coast of Ireland and their counterparts across the sea. And because, as I explained earlier, the toolkit had changed in Ireland over the 4,000 years, and these are towards the end of that period, the feeling was that the Irish Mesolithic people had become isolated from the rest of the Mesolithic colonies across the water. But these cowrie shells tell a different story. There has to be communication if they're wearing the same type of jewelry. So moving on from the cowrie shells then, we have crab claws. A lot of crab claws from the site mixed in with the shell, and these crab claws are identified as the edible red crab, the one that we eat today. So when you have your crab claws down in Fanor or in the pubs in Doolin, the next time, just think that actually 6,500 years ago, people were having the same meal. And it has continued right down through time. The next slide, I have to tell her. That doesn't matter. So now we have fish bone and bird bone. Bird bone, scant enough on the site. The specialist tells us that it is actually, she couldn't identify it down to species, but it's belonged to either large seabirds, probably shag or cormorant or some of the large gulls. A lot of fish bone from the site. You can see the teeth there of wrasse, which is, you know, the common rockfish that you still find on the coast today. And the other fish that we found, there's a list of fish there that you can see, all common fish that are found on the site today. You know, you can catch them down there today. All these fish were being caught by Mesolithic people back in the 6,500 years ago at Fanor. Now, what mammals were available to them? We found some mammal bone on the site. Most of it was too small to identify to species, but this tooth was found, and the specialist identified it as a pig tooth. She couldn't be certain whether it was wild pig or a boar tooth, but we have radiocarbon date on that, which dated back to around 6,500 years ago. So it was definitely a wild boar. So they're hunting wild boar at Fanor as well. And the next thing is we move on. The other thing we found is our burnt hazelnut shell, which is nothing peculiar about that. Hazelnut shell are found on a lot of Mesolithic sites and early prehistoric sites. So nothing unusual about that, but they are obviously eating hazelnut as well, and probably other berries and fruits that are available to them. The charcoal from the site is very interesting. The charcoal from both sites is dominated completely by Scots pine. And Mary Dillon, who is the charcoal expert, she said that this lack of diversity and the dominance of Scots pine is a unique in our Irish archaeology on sites. Usually you get a spread. It's not unusual to have Scots pine, but not to have it as such a dominant species. And the native Scots pine, it's interesting that the native Scots pine still survives in the Burren to this day at Rock Forest. Recent research has shown that. So this is the type of tree that the hunter-gatherers would have been felling for whatever they were using it on the site. And it's not alone. I mean, they weren't just using it for firewood. It wasn't small branches and twigs that were found. The charcoal was good enough to tell us that it was actually trunks of trees or very large branches were involved. So they were obviously targeting this timber for some reason or other. We'll have to look into that and come up with an explanation for it in the future. So moving on to the stone material, the sandstone, chert, and shale and flint are the three stone types that we find at the sites. Now the bedrock is limestone, but we've very few limestone artifacts. Now looking at the sandstone first, Elaine spoke to you there about the heat-shattered stone, a huge amount of heat-shattered stone on site 1 particularly, on both sites. We've examined that from site 1 and we have found that they targeted elongated cobbles and also flattish cobbles with concavities in them, depressions in them, which make very good polishing stones or grinding stones. And here are some examples of that material, as long with some of the flakes and the shattered stuff, but very large flakes and some very interesting tools among the sandstone, polishing stones especially. The next slide shows 4 very large sandstone flakes. Now, Peter Woodman was particularly interested in these, because they fitted in with his theory that the Mesolithic people used whatever stone was available to them to make their tools. When all those maps showing you all the sites in the north of Ireland, people were on the impression that the Mesolithic people only stayed up around the north of Ireland because there was flint there. But these sites, Ferreter's Cove on our site, shows that they made do with whatever stone was available to them. It was more important for them where their sources of food were rather than their sources of stone. So Peter, he was very helpful to us. Unfortunately, he analysed the stone tools from site 1, but unfortunately he passed away before he was able to do the second site for us. But we're really grateful to him, and I like to show him there because he was a big contributor to us and gave us plenty of confidence to keep going on the site. So as well as sandstone, we have a small amount of flint, which is mainly small flint pebbles, which they just struck, didn't make very complicated tools, just struck the pebbles and made either expedient knives or cutting tools or scrapers. There's one nice piece of flint there. You can see a flint blade from site 2. And the shale on the site, lots of, no chert on the site, lots of chert. And you can see there on the right-hand side, some nice quality chert from site 1. And these chert cores, which are, chert cores are the stones or the blocks of chert that they use to flake off their tools. So they're doing this on the site. So they're making their chert tools, some of their chert tools on the site, particularly on site 1. Now in site 2, which is much earlier, the chert tools are a lot bigger and more diagnostic of the later Mesolithic period, where they use these very large blades and flakes. So you see this very nice long pointed blade, and a second one from the site as well, which is a really fine example of a typical later Mesolithic band type flake. And it's got retouch work at the end there, and you can see the nice point. So it could make a very nice knife or dagger or even a spearhead. The next tools that we found, or other tools that we found, are shale. So shale occurs on the site. Oh no, sorry, before I go to the shale, I just have to show you these chert, this cache of chert finds. And you can see in the lower slide there that they were stacked against the the bedrock. There was a step in the bedrock on the shell midden site where all the material was stacked up against this step. But when we excavated down, we found against the step this stack of tools. So whoever put them there did not, obviously intended to come back for them, but they were left there. But these are significant for the Mesolithic. There are a lot of these caches found, and Peter Woodman intended to include this in a study on caches that he was doing, but unfortunately never got around to doing that. The next slide shows the shale blades. A lot of shale flakes from the site from the making of axes. You'll see some of those later from Doolin, so I'm not showing them here. You've got blades there on the left-hand side, nice cutting tools, and on the right-hand side, two very nice shale. One a shale point, which is a classic tool from the Mesolithic, and the beige one is one of my favorite tools from the site. It's got a bevel end on it there, and it makes a perfect scoop for taking the limpets out of the shell. So I regard that as a limpet scoop from the site. So following that, we have these two very important tools as well. On the left is a kerry point, which is a stone knife, called a kerry point because this type of tool was identified as a diagnostic Mesolithic tool at Ferreter's Cove. And when Peter Woodman saw this, he said, this is definitely a kerry point, as was a second one that we have from the site. On the right is a moina point or spearhead. We were delighted to find this find because it also is a diagnostic Mesolithic tool or weapon. So it actually is a very finely finished spearhead. And it's called a moina point because this type of tool was found at Loch Moina, where it was first identified as a Mesolithic tool. They're very finely finished, so finely finished that many of them are regarded as ceremonial, for ceremonial use, rather than actually using them as spears to spear fish, which was probably what they were used for, if not ceremonial use. So moving on from there, we have the stone axes. Good number of stone axes from both sites. You see the one on the right there, the large stone axe. That was the finest stone axe that we found on the site. Very finely finished, finely ground and polished edge, sides and cutting edge, and a smaller one beside it. But down on the left-hand side, at the bottom slide there, shows you what we call a rough out, a stone axe rough out. This is an axe, a cobble that has been shaped into the shape of an axe, but hasn't quite been finished. And you can see the rough cutting edge there still flaked. Eventually that would have been ground into like the one on the right-hand side to give you the finished product. So they're obviously finishing their axes on the site. So, and we've got plenty of flakes to show that they're doing that. The last slide there on the axis shows this miniature axe, a really little gem, only about 3 centimeters long. I've seen a lot of axes in the museums and that, and this is the smallest one I think I've come across. And it's got a lot of concretions on it there, but beneath, if they were, we haven't dared to clean those off yet because we want used wear analysis done on it at some stage. But it's really very well finished and a really nice fine cutting blade on it. So I'm not sure what it was used for. Was it a token or what? But it was an excellent find from the site. Moving on from there, just to give a recap on where this material is coming from. Most of the organic material comes from the site itself, as does the flint and the sandstone. But the axe roughouts, there's no shale available close to Fanor. You have to go to Slieve Elva, but the chances are most likely they went to Doolin, where we're going to go now to see the sort of roughouts that are available there. And some of the chert, the good quality chert, we didn't find large enough stones for them to struck their large chert flakes from. So they probably imported those from somewhere else or made them in some other part of the Burren. The radiocarbon dates range from 5,700 years ago on site 1 And the second site is much earlier, dating back as far as 6,900, revealing that hunter-gatherers were active on this coastline at least 1,000 years before farming was introduced. So we'll move on from there. I think we're going to move to Doolin now, and the clay layer that Elaine explained to you already that we excavated. Now, I can't mention Doolin without mentioning Matilda Knowles and the Limerick Field Club, who did research there in the late 1890s, and they discovered the same material that we have found. And so much so that she called it a regular stone axe factory. She found axe roughouts, hammer stones, and flakes, and that's exactly what we have recorded. And you'll see that now coming up. The first thing to show you are these roughouts. And this is what we're finding on the site. These are broken roughouts. The one on the left is the butt end of what was going to be an enormous axe. And the one on the right is the cutting end of a very large potential axe. But what happens is when you select your piece of shale, cobble, probably from the river of Doolin, and you take it out and you decide you're going to make an axe, and you start flaking along the sides and along the cutting edge of it and along the butt end to get it into shape, and the next thing it snaps on you. And that shows that there's a flaw in the shale. And obviously quite a lot of the cobbles do have flaws. So there's no point in continuing to make an axe from this, even if it was big enough to make a smaller axe, because if there are flaws in it, it's not going to be very useful. It's going to break when you start to use it. So they obviously, to save labor, they just discard that and start again making another one. And then it seems to us that they take those away from the site then, and they're finished somewhere else. These are the thinning flakes. We have thousands of these from the site. And you can see there, all those are what we call thinning flakes struck from the sides of those roughouts. And the next slide shows you a hammerstone and some of these thinning flakes as well. The hammerstone, a well-used hammerstone there. You can see all the work. The hammerstones are sandstone, so they're harder than the shale, and they make very good hammerstones for shaping the axes and flaking off these flakes. The next one shows another broken roughout with flakes of the same texture, and probably these flakes are from that roughout. We will be doing refitting exercises to prove that in the post-ex when we get round to it. And after that, we have another, I think, roughout on the clay itself. I'm not sure, a very fine one, lovely quality church, lovely quality shale, but left there for some reason. Maybe it just wasn't finished and they intended to finish it, but it was left. And the next slide shows a hammerstone and flakes, which the axe maker just stuck into the ground and went away, and obviously intended coming back presumably, but never did. And he left a very fine oblong hammerstone there with those flakes where he was working. And the next slide shows a couple of, we do get one or two, oh no, these are the hammerstones, sorry, I thought. These are hammerstones from 2017. We found numerous hammerstones on the site, and you can see the three there on the right, were on the top slide, were found together, so it was little cache of hammerstones left in place. And you can see the one at the bottom just shows you the useware that's on all these stones. So they're all utilized hammerstones. And we have at least double that amount from 2018 and 2019 as well. And these are two finished tools that we found on the site. The top one is a chisel, and you can see the right-hand slide there shows the profile of it, and you can see the very nice ground cutting edge of it. And the one below is a small axe, and it also, on the right-hand side at the bottom, you can see the facets where it was sharpened. So these were finished products. They're quite small. They're smaller than the normal ones that the large roughouts that we find on the site. So it's very likely that these were just tools that these axe makers had on them at the time, and they either lost them or left them on the site for some reason. And the last slide I'm going to show you just shows that there's more than axe manufacturing going on this site. We found a lot of these large, you see the large flake there at the bottom. This is a very large elongated flake, which has nothing to do with the manufacture of axes. This is striking off flakes or blades for their own use. And we've quite a substantial number of these from the site as well. So some areas are a tendency to have more of these than others, and we'll be examining those in detail in the post-ex. We haven't done much post-ex on Doolin yet. Most of the post-ex we've done is on Fanor. So there are the dates from Doolin to date, 5,900 years ago to 7,000 in the later Mesolithic, and overlapping with Fanor, which shows that the people were using this complete coastline for their exploiting the resources on them for their food and for their tools. Just to recap on the main finds, or the main, just a summary really of what we have found to date. And we've established a Mesolithic presence in Northwest Clare. We've Mesolithic dates for stone axe manufacture at Doolin, whereas it was always thought to be a Neolithic or Bronze Age site. We pushed it well back into the Mesolithic period. We've new variations in the Irish Mesolithic stone tool kit with the large sandstone flakes from Fanor. We've the earliest dated personal adornment in the perforated cowrie shells, the jewellery there, and a high instance of Scots pine use on a Mesolithic site in Ireland, which is highly unusual. And so we need answers for that. The acknowledgments, I just have to acknowledge the three landowners there at the top who were facilitated us and allowed us cross their land and excavate on their land. And the Royal Irish Academy and the government bodies, the National Monument Service and National Museum and the Heritage Council for their assistance as well. And of course, the Burren Trust's volunteers, a huge part in the site. And I've named some of them there, as you can see, from that worked on the Doolin end. I haven't put in the people from Fanor because I need a couple of slides and we don't have time, and we haven't time to read them. So Elaine Lynch for the site supervision and post-ex that she's doing and has done for us. So that's really it. I leave you there with some slides of the happy days on the site, which most were the odd grim day there, but at the same time, as you can see, a marvelous place to work. And I think everybody got benefited from it, and we're still benefiting from this work. So I hope I've got that done more or less within my time. So back to you, Annalisa.
Thank you so much, Michael. That was absolutely fascinating. We in the Burren Trust, we're absolutely amazed by the level of passion that we have from all the people that we work with, the experts, starting with the farmers and also all of the experts in bees, birds, botany. But there's nobody that tops the enthusiasm of the Burren conservation volunteers. So we're going to ask Eileen O'Connor to talk to us for a few minutes about the experience of the Burren conservation volunteers working on the archaeological sites, and also a little bit more about the other work that the Burren conservation volunteers do. So I'll ask you to unmute there, Eileen.
Yeah, I think I should be unmuted.
Great.
All okay? Yeah. And I'm just going to try and share this now and see if everything goes okay for us. That looking okay? Yeah. So for tonight, I'm just going to speak to you for a few minutes about my experience as a volunteer on the archaeological sites, both at Fanor and in Doolin, and then a little bit about the work of the BCV in general, just the kind of projects that we're involved in. So first off, back in 2010, when I joined the BCV, or the Burren Conservation Volunteers, some of the work we were doing in the beginning was scrub clearance and a few other projects. And then in 2011, an opportunity arose to actually go on an archaeological excavation they were looking for volunteers for a week at a time. So I took a week off work and I headed off out to Fanor, and I met the most wonderful bunch of people and started, I suppose, 10 years now plus of being involved in these projects in different parts of the Burren. So that week out in Fanor, I suppose, was highly educational. I had no experience at all of archaeological excavation, and thanks to Michael and Clodagh and Elaine and even all of the other volunteers, we all learned so much on that site. All the different techniques that Elaine was talking about earlier on, we got to practice all of those. we were shown everything from drawing, recording, excavating. Everything was shown to us and shared with us. So after that then, I suppose I continued to be involved in Fanor and also down in Doolin. The next picture here is to do more with the Doolin site. This was the survey of the site down in Doolin and setting up those markers that Elaine was talking about, which helped to try and define where the trenches would go in. But again, as volunteers, we had a huge, I suppose, input from Michael, Claude and Elaine, all the techniques needed to help us to learn about how to set up the site and actually set up the site then. Following on from that, we've been involved in post-excavation for a good few years now. And this is just one of the many days that we have spent going through the artifacts and the items that were found at the 3 different sites and learning how to catalogue them, learning how to, wash them, measure them, draw them, everything to do with actually the post-excavation site. So as an experience, it has been really rich and rewarding. And many of the volunteers have completed the diploma in archaeology as a result of it. And we look forward to many more days when we get back on site and can do some more work. Just a few minutes then on the Burren Bio Trust volunteers as a group. So we were set up in 2010 by Burren Bio Trust, who is the umbrella group over us, but we have our own committee and we plan our events for every month. We have a rolling calendar and we try to have at least one event a month. We have an expert and a leader at each event, and the leader is one of ourselves who is first aid training and takes charge of logging people into the event. But the expert will be somebody who has a lot of experience in the event we're doing. Is that okay? So the expert comes, depends on what event we're actually doing. So some of the events that we're involved in, we have the coastal cleanup. We do one of these pretty much, I think, once, if not twice a year. And we try and link in with Antashka's Spring Clean and Clean Coast. And we're removing a lot of waste from the coastline of the Burren over the year. Habitat and monument site management, I suppose due to the changes in farming practices, there's a lot more hazel scrub encroaching in different parts of the Burren, and part of our work is to try and preserve some of the sites for some butterfly breeding sites, bat sites, and also the archaeological monuments to prevent them being encroached by the scrub. This is a picture of the bat site out in Rouen, where we're involved in just again maintaining the landscape for those bats. We have a big role in species monitoring, and every year we try and train up people in butterfly monitoring, which is a national program run by the Biodiversity Centre, and we contribute data, and a lot of our members would walk a certain loop once a week between April and September, and all that data then goes into the national program and also fed into Europe, and butterflies are a great way of monitoring the environment.
Sorry, Eileen.
Yeah.
I just say to you that the sound is fine, but we're not seeing your slides. That may be to do with a Wi-Fi or a technical issue.
Okay. Will I just keep going, because I'm actually on the last one. Sorry, everybody, but I can share the slides later on. I'm not sure why that happened now. Sorry about that. And then I suppose the very last thing that we are involved in, I can try one more time and just see, but I think it's hi everyone. Don't want to go through the whole thing again, but we might get a few slides out of this one. Let's see, just see if it works now this time. It doesn't. Any good, Annalisa? Can you see it now? No?
Yes, we have lovely picture of dry stone walling there. So maybe if you just want to.
Yeah. So this is one of the final projects that we're involved in, which is the dry stone walling, where we actually go out into the Burren and actually help to maintain some of the fabulous walls dotted all around the Burren, reclaiming them, rebuilding them, and again, an expert on each one. I'll just quickly go back through the slides so you can see there's only 5 of them. So this is the butterfly. This is the bat site. It's an old stable. This is Moira hard at work doing some scrub clearing. And this is the litter, the load of litter out on the beach. So that's really it. If anyone wants to get involved, check us out on the website, burrenview.com, and the details are there of how to contact us. And we'd love to see new members, and we'd love to see old members back with us when things get good again after COVID, I suppose. Okay, so that's, sorry about that. Not sure what happened with those slides. And that's
Thanks
me.
so much.
Okay.
Thank you, Eileen. That was great. Fantastic to have a little bit of a sense of what the Burren Bio conservation volunteers are doing. So with regard to the archaeological sites, I've been asked to say that there have been a number of volunteers trained by Michael, Clodagh and Elaine, and they're not taking new volunteers for the archaeological work. They're going to work with the volunteers who have been trained up in a process of training. But the other work that Eileen described, the scrub clearing and other work that doesn't require detailed training and a commitment of time to the training, when things go back to normal, there will be opportunities for people to become involved if they're interested. And you can always have a look at the Burren Bio Trust website, just burrenbio.com, and see under our work, you'll see the work of the volunteers. So we're going to ask you now just to take a couple of minutes. We got some, asked some Burren Bio conservation volunteers to tell us a little bit about what they like about working as volunteers, and we have there in the chat box the link to a video. It's just a 2-minute video, so I'm going to let everyone go to the video, and then we'll come back in 3 minutes for questions and answers. Thank you.
I'm not sure if we've got to go back into this
No,
again.
Michael, leave it. Don't touch.
Now, I think we have most people back after watching the video. We'll just wait a little minute, and then we'll go on to do some, to cover some of the questions. We're just at 9 o'clock, so we'll give it just another few minutes of questions. So Pranjali and myself have been looking at the questions that came in via the chat box. And there are some very specific questions for Elaine and Michael. You might like to unmute Elaine and Michael just so that we can hear you there. Lovely, that's great. So
okay, yeah.
That's super, that's great. So one question that came up was what did you do ahead of time to know where to excavate? I suppose specifically for the Doolin site, how did you know that the artifacts were there?
Well, what happened there, following our excavations in Fanor, we always knew about the clay layer at Doolin. I was aware of it. But we had found so much material at Doolin, or at Fanor, that when we had the big storms at the end of 2013, I think it was, I went down to Doolin because a huge amount of the sand dunes had been pulled back. And here an enormous amount of clay was exposed. And in that clay layer, we could see a lot of shale flakes and roughouts. So that's how we discovered there was still a lot of material there. Now, in the meantime, the sand dunes have slipped back down again and covered up a lot of it, and the boulders have regathered over them. But after the storm, a lot of it was opened up. So we started to monitor it then, and then we applied for licenses to excavate it, and it's followed on since then.
Very good, thank you.
Thanks, Michael. There's a lovely question from Karen. Given that the Doolin Axe Factory is now on an exposed stretch of the shore, what would the site have looked like back then? Was it much further inland with erosion eating away on the land?
Yes, no, it was 6,000 years ago. The sea level was probably about 5 meters lower than it is today. So, and even 7,500 years ago, it was 10 meters lower. So back then the sea would have been out much further than it is today. So they would have been actually quite some distance, maybe hundreds of meters from the sea. So they would have actually been dealing with probably an area where the river flowed in across level ground, and they were able to access that to gather the cobbles, that the shale cobbles that are water rolled by the river. Today you go down, it's the situation is a bit distorted because you're looking at the storm beach with all the storm cobbles from the storm beach. They wouldn't have been there at the time. They would have been, maybe even a half a kilometer out to sea, out further towards the sea. So they would have been a good distance from the sea at the time. So it would have been completely different landscape. And the same thing in Fanor. They may, the sea might have been so far back that these people might have even been behind sand dunes, with sand dunes between them and the sea, if sand dunes were there at all at that time.
Okay, very good. Elaine, sorry, I put the spotlight on you there, Elaine. We had a question from Cara. How were you able to date the two contexts at a separation of 300 years?
Oh, yeah, well, we dated the charcoal from the site. And I can't remember if it was hazelnut, but when we were excavating, though, it was actually me who excavated. We were there, one volunteer, I can't remember who was helping me, but so as we were excavating down, so we took off like a little bit of layer of clay, and then we found all these shale flakes, and we would have collected any charcoal or hazelnut in that layer. So Dad will be able to tell you for definite if it was charcoal or hazelnut, but that's what we would have used to date those two layers. And like, I suppose we took off a layer of those flakes, and then we found that blank, and then we found like another layer of flakes underneath that. And again, we would have collected any charcoal or hazelnut that we would have found, and at the time of excavating we would have collected that with the aim to date it. So we would have bagged them up straight away and sealed them and marked those for a good sample to date. So we knew that that the charcoal or the hazelnut, whatever it was dated, would have, we know exactly where it came from, what layer it came from, and we would be able to associate it with what artifacts were around it as well. So that's what we were using, yeah. I think it was charcoal, Dad, was it, or hazelnut?
Hazelnut, I think,
Yeah.
in that case, and some shell as well, you know. So I think in fact, I'd say there were two hazelnut dates, which are very good for accurate. You get very accurate dates from hazelnut. So we'd use hazelnut wherever we can for dating.
There's a message for both of you from Gareth Jones. In 1966, I collected a midden axe / limpet hammer from the Doolin site, 16.8 centimeters by 7.2 by 1.3 centimeters. Details available from Gareth Jones if you're interested. And there, the question.
We're always interested in.
Okay.
Yep.
Okay.
So, certainly. So if he'd send us in, he'd send me the details. I'll get onto it because I'd like to see what it is he found.
Okay, that's great, Gareth. If you can get in touch with Michael, that'll be great. Tim has asked, he's curious about the current situation about preserving archaeological sites in County Clare.
In general, or on the coastline, obviously there's erosion all the time, and it's continuing because we're monitoring it in Doolin, and we can see it eroding, and we can actually, you can see the sand dunes there that Elaine showed you at the back in the background are slipping down all the time. The farmer's losing a lot of his field. He's put up in the years we've been there, he's replaced his posts a couple of times, and they keep being eroded. So it's ongoing on the coast. So that would suggest that whether it's climate change or rising sea levels, certainly it would seem. We've seen a lot of changes, you know, even in the bedrock down in Doolin, that has changed since we went there first. You saw where we put our yellow markers. Some of the bedrock that we put that into has been ripped up and thrown up onto the stone beach as well. So it's ongoing erosion on the coastline, if that's what he's talking about. If that's the question relates to that. Certainly, I'm not sure that much can be done about it except to try and monitor and do what we're doing is to do rescue excavations to retrieve the information. I mean, Fanor Site 1 has completely, after the storms at the end of 2013, that site has been completely removed. If we hadn't been lucky enough to find that site and excavate it before we did, we would have got no information from it. That information would have been completely lost to us. And we wouldn't know we had Mesolithic sites in Clare. Site 2 is still there, part of it is still there, where we keep an eye on it all the time in case in fact, this weekend now we're going to get some more storms, but Mary Howard lives above it there. She's our watchdog on that site. She minds it all the time for us.
Super, that's fantastic. Mary Howard is one of the Burren Bio conservation volunteers and very much involved in the Burren Bio Trust. I had another specific question from Hugh. He asked, in the case of the sandstone tools that were found, do you know where the sandstone came from?
Yes, the sandstone comes from cobbles that originally came out of the glacial drift, and you find them along the coast. If you look at any of the cobble beaches along, especially at Fanor where we found them, you will find cobbles, sandstone cobbles, as well as limestone cobbles eroding out all the time at the top of the tide mark, and they're being eroded out of originally out of the land, out of the ice age drift, and they end up in the sea, and they're thrown up all the time, and they become water rolled. So it's those stones that they were collecting. Now, at the time, as someone has asked the question, they would have had to travel right down to the shore where it was at that time and collect those and bring them back to the site. You know, they wouldn't have been where they were. They were some distance from the actual eroding coastline. But that's the source for the sandstone, and it's all those nice rounded water rolled cobbles that they're using. We don't know why they're using them as grindstones and anvils and that. Why they're all ending up in a heat shattered state is one of the big questions. We thought at first it was to do with cooking the shellfish, the same as you get in a Fulloch Fia. You know, sandstone is used to heat the water, to boil the food, or to, you know, parboil it. So we reckon that maybe they were doing that. But since we found so many tools being made from this material, we wonder, is it being done purposely to create tools? Sandstone is very hard to flake. So if you put it in the fire, it explodes, it bursts, and you might get nice flakes from it. And so maybe that is the reason. And maybe that explains the Scots pine in the fire, because it burns much hotter than other trees, which would have been readily available, easily collected for firewood. But Scots pine burns that bit hotter, so maybe it's more effective at shattering the sandstone than the others. That's a possible explanation for it.
Thank you very much, Michael. So I think we're going to draw to a close there, but just to say, we have had so many lovely messages in the chat box. Thanks for sharing all of this fascinating information, says Cara. And John says, well done, Michael, excellent presentation. Deirdre said that was wonderful, thank you. And Susan from California and Sheila from Scotland send their good wishes and their thanks. And Anna Himmel, we received a message from somebody, Osquelga, and congratulating you on the amazing achievements of all the presenters. So well done. With that, we close this session of National Heritage Week. Thanks very much, everyone, for joining us, and we hope to see you all at our future events. And just to say to you, we have a couple of other longer videos from the Burren Bio Trust, which we've put up as part of National Heritage Week. One of them is about our Learning Landscape Symposium. So you can see that on the Burren Bio YouTube channel. And there's also a video which is about the intangible cultural heritage here in the Burren, specifically the practice of winterage, where the cows are brought to the mountains for the winter. So we'll close the session now. Thank you so much for joining us, and take care.